It doesn't take much to build a great physique. And if you follow these simple gains principles, I'm confident you'll achieve at least 80% of your total muscle mass and strength. After that, it's all about refining the details, which only really matters to advanced early lifters, which chances are is not you. Most lifters are novices and intermediates. So let's tackle on those problems before we overcomplicate their lives and treat them like competitive lifters, because they're not. You're probably not, and I wasn't up until recently. It's gonna take over 5 years of training for you to hit that point where every little detail matters. The nuance is so key at that point, but before that, man, you got so much room to grow if you just keep your mind straight on what really is important. And that is gonna be the fundamental basics, which aren't going away, ever. Because they can't. It's too effective. It's time proven. And it's how all the best natties that you follow and that even give contradictory advice today built their physiques. So it's funny how they forget where they came from, but I digress. Let's cover these basics, starting with the fundamental movement patterns. So any good program will feature compounds and isolations, but the compounds will take the majority of the volume. It's what should be prioritized to net the largest stimulus and to get that shotgun effect. Major muscles are being attacked in synchrony. So these are, for the upper body, horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull, which will usually be a bench press, overhead press, weighted pull-up, and row. The variation doesn't matter. It's about the plane of motion. Of course, you'll have some deviations within. So an incline press can be closer to horizontal if it's a 15 to 30 degree angle, or it can be closer to vertical if it's 45 to 60 degrees. Likewise for pulling, if you're completely upright doing a pull-up in the frontal plane, that's a 100% vertical pull. If you're doing a lat pull down where the cable is directly diagonal, that's kind of a hybrid between a vertical and a horizontal, which the horizontal would be an inverted row, because now your torso is not all the way upright, it's parallel to the floor. So you have to look at your body angles and the direction of resistance. And of course, all this is common sense. You just need to look at the movement and you can figure out instantly what it is. Though sometimes it can be confusing when we talk about exercises like the dip. Is it vertical or horizontal? Well, in this case, you can argue it's vertical, but the muscles used are that of horizontal because the chest is the primary mover. And notice how when you lean more forward, you're getting even closer to horizontal, and that's where the biasing comes into play. So that's for the upper body. In terms of the lower body, it basically boils down to including squats and hinges. And there's a continuum within that, which Greg Nuckols wrote an excellent article on. I'd highly recommend you all read it. You can see that as a sliding scale because many squats have an element of hinge, like if you're doing a low bar wide stance squat using a lot of posterior chain, compared to, say, a front squat where you're completely upright. Now you got that knee flexion. You're going all the way forward, really biasing the quads. And of course, if you're doing something like a conventional deadlift, there is some knee bend in the bottom. Unless you're doing straight-legged or an RDL, there is some quad in there. So it's not a pure posterior chain developer. And the same thing if we do a trap bar deadlift, which now, because of the center of mass and the fact that you can bend your knees even more, it's even closer to a squat. Though surprisingly, it's still more hingy than a sumo deadlift, which a lot of guys think that is a good quad builder. So I don't want to confuse you on this, but just look at this chart and base your programming around what you need muscularly. So that's for the compound movements. In terms of the isolations, it basically boils down to flexion and extension of the limbs, and that the legs and the arms basically have the same function, but upside down. Actually, the hamstrings are called the bicep femoris. It's the biceps of your legs. So it's the same, just inverted, bro. Literally, if you're filming yourself, flip. And that's the function. And then, of course, there's spinal flexion and extension. Flexion is for your abs, extension is for lower back. Doesn't have to be more complicated than that. And they cover most of your bases. Your system should have all of these patterns. If any of them are neglected, it will show up in your physique. You will have glaring muscular weaknesses like we see with some competitive lifters who don't include some of these features. And obviously, you can also create your own custom physique. No, it's not just about genetics, as we've clearly observed in those who are either torso dominant versus arm dominant, or those who have huge lower bodies and smaller upper bodies. No, you can bias the way you look based off how far you deviate away from the balance of all these movement patterns. For example, a calisthenics athlete will primarily do vertical pulls, and it shows. It's pull-up city where the lats are just flared out like a cobra, but oftentimes there's no spinal erectors or upper back, even though pull-ups do work your upper back if you use all the grips. But if you're just a specialist who's going to use maybe neutral, chin up, and then a normal grip, yeah, you're not going to be maximized. And we see a similar phenomenon in strongmen who have disproportionately absurd overhead presses. Overhead presses that some of the best benchers in the world can't even come close to because of years of vertical pressing specialization. And you know what? When you look at the delts, it shows. But the lower pec is often lagging unless they did do a lot of benching on the side, but many times they don't. Then for lower body, just look at the Silva era. They intentionally created a V-taper physique. We have natural bodybuilding today, and they're all X-framed at the world level. But why did the greats of back then not have that look? Well, it was on purpose. So they had a specific ratio in mind, the Grecian standard, and even Steve Reeves. So depending on what you specialize in addition to your genetics, being the structure and how responsive some muscles are, you can create a custom physique. Now, that should come after the basics were enforced. So that's why I'm saying you need to have all these movement patterns, at least 1-to-1, for your standard volume. And then anything that goes beyond that point should be based off what you want to build or based off what's muscularly lagging, because sometimes you want something, but it's not what you need for your current physique. So you just gotta drop those goals for now because this needs more work. Good example. Let's say your lats are a strong point and you have weighted pull-ups and barbell rows. And you're like, wow, I just want to keep getting wider. Let me add in another vertical pull. Yet your upper back thickness is inexistent. I mean, you could do that if you want, you do you, but right now, if you're being objective, that's probably not what you need. If you're trying to be balanced, that is. But again, if you want more width, you do you. I don't want to contradict what I just said about building your dream physique. My point is, you're not going to replace all of your pulling volume with pull-ups. You won't do 3 vertical pulls, right? You can have at least 1 vertical and 1 horizontal. And then the last one is whatever the hell you want based off your muscular needs and or desires and or both if they happen to align. So speaking of volume, the essential minimum, which covers all your needs, is going to be 2 compounds and 1 isolation, all of which are 2 to 3 sets per exercise, though I recommend 2 these days. After that point, you can add 1 more compound per muscle and 1 more isolation, but it'll be of your choice, depending what you care about. So if we look at a simple push-pull leg setup, because it'll be the easiest way to divide this in terms of my example, a push day could feature any bench press, any overhead press, and then your third exercise, if your shoulders are lagging, do another vertical-ish motion or a hybrid, like an incline. But if your pecs are lagging, you can do something like weighted dips. And for your isolation work, function of the triceps is elbow extension, which is the same thing if you're doing a push down or traditional extension, aka skull crusher. You do whatever is easiest on your elbows and what allows for the greatest progression and possible alignment depending how you're feeling that day. So I always recommend opening up with a push down to warm up the elbows and then do a heavy free weighted extension. So one is going to be for the squeeze, the other is going to be more stretch based, but not necessarily because we're trying to induce stretch media hypertrophy. It's just that this happens to feel best for the elbow joints. That's a simple push day. If we're talking about the basics here, pull day would of course open up with the hardest movement. In my opinion, the way to pull up is going to be best. You pick the grip that is most appropriate for your current weaknesses. These days I favor super wide. Then your second exercise, if you're only going to be 2, would be a row of some kind. Being inverted, barbell, dumbbell, it doesn't matter. Though, if you were never planning on dropping the rows and you want to do more vertical pulling volume, I would actually reserve it as your final movement, which means that you do another vertical pull as your second motion. So it could be weighted pull up, lat pull down of your choice, and then a row. And the benefit here is that it gives you more options in terms of exercise selection. So when we talk about building an aesthetic back, that's of course going to feature the lats and the upper back, which is the traps, rhomboids, teres. You can even argue rear delts. But then there's also the spinal erectors, which are in the center. Now, you can train those separately with the function of spinal extension, and of course your hip hinges contribute, which is probably how you're going to get the majority of your mass, if I'm being honest with you. But then you can also sprinkle in additional volume through bend over rowing motions. And by doing rows as a third exercise, you can now include them, which allows you to get a good enough stimulus for the erectors, but doesn't hurt your recovery because the weight is significantly reduced. Your back is already tired. Everything was technically hit, but now you can get more out of less weight, but not to the point where it's going to cause you to terminate a set. So that's just one suggestion I could give you. Otherwise, you can pick whatever freaking row you want. Chest support's obviously going to offer the most stability. You can do one-arm dumbbell row if you have a lat imbalance of some kind. You can do an inverted cable row. An inverted regular row, actually with a power rack, is excellent here since you are pre-fatigued. But in general, I like to program 2 vertical pulls, 1 horizontal, if you're going to do 3 compounds for the back. Otherwise, keep it 50-50, pull up, row, you're done. And then for the isolation work, again, we're talking about the limbs to keep it simple, though I would include a reversal fly motion, particularly with the chest expander to get a nice squeeze on the rear delts, and it gives you more upper back volume, which is always nice. But talking about the biceps, it's mostly going to be elbow flexion. Of course, the brachioradialis and the brachialis also have that function. If you want to squeeze, you do a spider curl where you're bending over the bench. If you want a more lengthened bias, you put your arm on the bench such that it's a preacher curl, or you lay back, incline curl style, or a pelican curl. It doesn't matter. The point is, you do a fucking curl because compound movements are not enough. And if you listen to minimalists who say, well, I build big buys doing chin-ups, unfortunately, you're listening to genetic elites, because I listened to that advice, build up to 4 plates actually on pulls, and my arms were only 16 inches. So it wasn't until I really started specializing with the isolation work that they finally blew up, and I got up to 17.2. So look at guys who've been there, done that, who actually had the numbers to prove it. So ignore all that, including if you're a calisthenics athlete. You better be doing some ring curls or pelican curls. Never skip that. Then obviously the amount of supination versus pronation determines the muscular biasing. If you want to remove the biceps as much as possible, although they'll never get disengaged, the closer to pronated, the better. If you're somewhere in the middle, semi, so like an easy bar, that's usually going to be good enough. But always do elbow flexion and elbow extension. And for legs, you'll build the majority of your muscle, if I'm being honest with you, with your squats and hinges. Everything else is to build a few areas that maybe you didn't maximize off the basic compounds. But truth be told, if you did nothing but barbell back squats and any deadlift, let's say RDL. Let's say you did a high bar ATG pause squat and maybe 3 sets of RDLs. So 6 sets total per workout for your legs, 12 sets a week. You would build magnificent legs. And that's actually how a lot of old school bodybuilders did it. And many of them had legs between 26 and 28 inches. Actually, Leroy Colbert had 28-inch legs, and all he did was squats. Didn't even like deadlifts. So you can go far. Of course, your lower hamstring will be lagging because you need the knee flexion to activate it. It's the only head that won't get thoroughly built from hip hinges, and I learned that the hard way. But that just takes 1 leg curl to get the job done. So a simple routine is going to be a squat and hinge of your choice, whatever it is. Again, refer to Squat Hinge Continue by Greg Nuckols. You pick what's appropriate for you and your goals. Don't let anyone else tell you what you need. These days, I like hard squat variations, like doing them with safety straps to break up the eccentric and centric chain. So it's like a box squat, but you're still retaining that free squat movement pattern. I like using this Zercher harness by Robert Baraban. This way I can get the front squatting benefits without having to use the clean grip, which I'm not interested in perfecting. And surprisingly, this is harder. I like my SSB. And my least favorite these days is the low bar powerlifting style squat with a wider stance, because it allows me to lift way more weight than I need to. For me, there's about a 50-pound difference between low bar and the other variations. So I want to get more or less weight. And of course, wearing squat shoes to get more knee flexion is good, but that's what I need. My ass is massive. I want more quads now, surprisingly. For you, it could be the opposite. Then I generally favor good mornings because I want the erector biasing effect, and I don't want to have to load 500-600 pounds every workout in order to get a good stimulus for my posterior chain. I'd rather stick to the 200s, full range of motion. I'm good to go. Those 2 movements is everything. And then if you're following my 2-set strategy, you can add 1 more big exercise to get an even more developmental effect. And that is either going to be a unilateral exercise of some kind, being a Bulgarian split squat, lunge, etc., or something that is similar to what you did before, but regress in terms of difficulty, but the stimulus doesn't change that much. What I mean is a freaking belt squat. Why? Because now you're getting a bit more volume in for the quads, which, if that's the major area you care about, this is going to be good. But it does so while tractioning the spine. So all the axial loaded stuff that you just did, now it's literally pulling the discs apart. So it's restoration and strength build. So it feeds into everything you just did, and it's going to give you carryover to the back squat, and specifically build the front part of your leg, because you can't hinge at all. Remember what I said, squat, hinge, continue. So if you do 3 compounds, either belt squat or unilateral movement is what I strongly recommend. And then for the isolation, if I told you before that the legs are like the limbs, what do you think you're gonna pick? Extension, flexion, right? AKA leg extension, leg curl. Or if you're a home gym enthusiast or you don't wanna do a shortened movement, you can do a pendulum sissy squat or reverse Nordic for the leg extension part as a replacement. And then for leg curl, well, most people do the laying version, but you can also go seated. You can also go laying on your back, literally, and just curling with a cable. I call that the ghetto leg curl. Or you can do a regular Nordic curl or glute ham raise. But the functions are all the same is what I'm trying to tell you. Don't look at it in terms of exercises, just look at functions. Because once you understand the function, you can pick whatever exercise you want. It doesn't matter. That's why there is no best exercise. And the truth is, you're gonna rotate some anyway. So as long as you know what you're hitting, and again, it's so simple. So that's a basic template you can follow for legs. And if you want to do a little bit more volume for the posterior chain, you throw in a reverse hyperextension for more traction or a back extension. So that's the basic structure. And ideally, every major muscle should be hit twice a week. Now that begs the question, how much volume should you feature on a session per session basis or even on a weekly basis? Well, the optimal range, according to science, is 10 to 20 sets a week. Now you heard this and your immediate thought is, that means that the more you do, the better. And the closer I am to 20, the higher the stimulus will be. My argument is not necessarily because of the recovery demand, how strong you are, and diminishing returns, because that's really what it is. Not to mention better fatigue management. Do you have the capability of doing 20 sets a week? And do you understand that the way you train is going to be different than if you did a lower volume approach? What I mean is, it's personal preference. You pick your poison. I'm not going to force my beliefs on you. But if you're doing 3 to 5 sets per exercise, then you're going to want to leave reps in the tank and probably do shorter rest intervals of maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes between sets. You can do it longer if you want, and it's probably going to be even more effective, but maybe now those sets will be harder and you'll have a harder time doing the high volume workouts. If you're doing 20 sets a week, leave reps in reserve. Probably 2 to 3 per exercise. And then maybe some sets you can get closer to failure, but you should never hit momentary muscular failure. This is going to be your RP training style. On the other hand, you have the JP training style, or it's not even him who coined it, but in this way, you want to go to failure on most of your sets. 0 to 1 reps in reserve. But by doing so, you'll have to drastically increase your rest intervals to 2 to 5 minutes between sets. And you'll have to reduce the number of sets. In this case, max 2 to 3. But if I'm being honest, I'm only going to recommend 2 sets. And I personally train this way. I'm not going to do 3 sets moving forward, unless I know the set was super submaximal. If you're actually training hard, going balls to the wall, you're absolutely going to be on the lower end of the total weekly volume. 2 sets is going to be your average, and the benefit here is that you can do more movements now and lower your volume, such that you're getting a greater muscular biasing effect. You can attack more areas. You can hit everything that's fundamental and then beyond without taking away from that stimulus, because it's the same as if you did almost double the fucking work. So choose what you want. In terms of saving time, it's probably gonna be about the same when you factor in the rest intervals, but it's either you're at the lower end, more intense, higher end, less intense. Then there's even the in-betweens where you kind of waive your proximity to failure and your percentages. I'm not gonna cover that today, or else that goes beyond the simple basics, right? So my simple basic template is this: 3 compound movements per workout and 2 isolations, all of which are 2 sets each, for a total of 6 sets of compounds per workout and 4 sets of isolations, which gives you 12 sets of compounds per week and 8 sets of isolations per week, or 20 sets a week, which includes everything, not 52 sets a fucking week for legs, which we're seeing in some newer studies. You're never gonna see me train like that, though you could if you leave reps in reserve, which is what the study did, 2 RIR, with more sets per exercise, but they didn't do more exercise like what I'm doing. You get it? The max volume you're probably gonna need for muscle is 6 to 8 sets per workout. So I can probably push it a little bit more in terms of volume. If I were, it'd probably be an additional set for arms, but that would be like 1 set extra. So I might do 1 set of hammer curls, 2 sets of preachers, and then 2 sets of incline curls. Just so that I can say I biased the brachialis and the brachioradialis a little bit more, just in case. Or that I was able to hit 1 more isolation or 1 more compound. Let's say you're not including much vertical pressing in your program right now, but you do 1 set of OHB a week. Well, now you're doing 13 sets of presses a week, which isn't that different from 12, but at least you got the vertical pattern in. So what I'm saying is, if you think that your system's not gonna be balanced, it still could be if you feature low volume. So the template I mentioned to you before, horizontal and vertical push-pull, that can always be the default. but the volume across those movement patterns doesn't necessarily have to be equal after a certain point. That said, know that what I just mentioned is for the advanced guys. Now, in terms of exercise selection, please don't hyper-focus on what is optimal. Instead, focus on what is progressible, stable, and enjoyable. And know that there are many old school, time-proven exercises that tick all these boxes. It's probably something that's not based off modern biomechanics. It's probably the simple barbell lifts that you are already doing. There's nothing wrong with them. You just need to know what you're getting out of them and how to make them even more optimized for hypertrophy. And 9 out of 10 times, that's going to be simply slowing down the rep speed and pausing in the most difficult part of the lift, or making the lift even harder. So you can modify the old school basics. Like if you're using a barbell bench press to get big, you can switch over to the camber bar bench, which is arguably superior. You can also use a neutral bar if your shoulders have discomfort, or if you want a little bit of that cambered effect, but it's still a barbell at the end of the day. Likewise, if you're doing a dumbbell bench press versus a ring push-up, they're both comparable in terms of the converging effect. The rings, you get a little bit better squeeze. Dumbbells, you can argue the stability is slightly better, so they're kind of the same hypertrophy-wise. So the small deviations within the muscular function, you can weigh out the pros and cons, but it's all about what you need in that moment. Again, going back to your weaknesses. And also, the best exercises are usually going to be mid to lengthen biased, so weighted stretch based. So just off that, you can look at any exercise, new or from the past, and determine if it's effective. Is it mostly the contracted part or the bottom? Just look at yourself. Anecdotally, what has grown you the best? Full range of motion, but not just full range of motion. Beyond that point, or at least it's full range, right? But the most difficult part is usually going to be in the bottom of that exercise. So the bottom of a squat is most difficult. The bottom of a deadlift. It's not usually the lockout, right? We've all seen guys who can rack pull so much more weight, myself included. Weighted dips, it's the stretch in the bottom. Anything that is at max up to the 90-degree angle or below it, where there's the peak forces, is going to be best for growth. Sometimes this is going to be due to stretch mediate hypertrophy. Other times it'll be because some muscles have good leverages in those positions. And then there's just a generic factor that it's a superior strength curve overall. And you generally have more progressibility within those ranges. And speaking of progressive overload, most of you are going to stick to simple double progression, which is the simple act of having a rep zone. And when you hit the upper ends of that zone for all of your sets, you up the load. If something calls for 3 sets of 8 to 12, you would increase weight once you could do 12, 12, 12. That's in the most generic sense. Then there's dynamic double progression, which dynamically alters sets depending on proximity to failure. So logically speaking, if you can do 12, 12, 12, it must mean that your first set of 12 was not the failure. You left reps in reserve. So to compensate for this, you could up the load on your first set and then reduce on the following 2 sets to what you were supposed to do the previous session. This way, the proximity to failure aspect is always equated on a set per set basis. And you can move up or down on the first set or the second set, whatever. And if you're doing 2 sets per exercise, it's even simpler because now you can retain a higher proximity to failure. So you don't even need the dynamic aspect. If you got 10 reps on your first set and 8 on your second, they're both very close. And if the next workout you get 9 on your second, you still got 10 on your first. Again, the proximities aren't that different such that you may need to do extra volume to compensate for a lack of intensity. Hope this makes sense. What I'm trying to say is that's the most effective form of progression for 99% of you. And you shouldn't rush this process. Just let it happen naturally. Don't compromise your form. You must get stronger, all things being equal. We can argue all day about semantics, but if those numbers are not going up with double progression, with doing all the fundamental movements, with the appropriate volume that I just described to you, then there's something else going on, which is beyond the topic of basic programming. And one more thing, when you have plateaus with certain exercises, try to just be patient. Oftentimes they'll just resolve themselves, especially if there's some +1s happening on any given lift in the program. It might not just be the muscles time. Some muscles naturally microload, like the biceps. It could take a while to add 5 pounds to dumbbell curl. That's an impressive accomplishment, so don't stress. Just enjoy, be patient. There's probably nothing wrong with you. But in the event where you do have a legit plateau, bro, just rotate the exercise, which will not only minimize overuse and any possible joint stress that you might be experiencing, but it can unlock new gains, probably because you're hitting different joint angles, and it might correct a muscular weakness that maybe you were aware or weren't aware you had. So with that said, you should build a lot of muscle with these tips. I know I said more than I needed to. I apologize if this video was too lengthy. I just want you to think and focus on what matters. That's it. Hope you enjoyed this raw-ish segment. Let me know if you want more stuff like this, and I'll see you in the next video.